So thank you very much for your introduction, and for the invitation to be with you here today. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about why Barzakh and why us, and sort of when did this happen for us. So that's one part. And the other part is the future. So that was the past. And the future is that we're going to see if our marriage survives writing this book together.
Allahu alam bisawab.
So yeah, you will see that we approach the topic from different angles, and we will talk about that. But I thought it would be important to start with an explanation of why Barzakh became so crucial for us, for both of us at exactly the same time, because we've actually co-edited a book. That was tough. So the book is, the monograph is going to be quite something. But we co-edited a book called Muslim Networks from Hajj to Hip Hop. And we invited a number of scholars to talk about, Ibn Battuta, women's networks, ulama's networks. And then we invited a wonderful scholar from Morocco, friend of ours, Tayyib al-Ghazi, and asked him if he would write a postscript. And he came, we had the conference, and he said, everything that you're talking about is Barzakh. And we're like, what's Barzakh? So we'd read it in the Quran, but we didn't know what he was talking about. And he said, well, Ibn Arabi's notion of the Barzakh seems to inform the way in which you're talking about networks. So that was the beginning, and that was around 2004. So that's quite a long time ago. Now, when he talked about Ibn Arabi, of course, we've looked, and Bruce has studied Ibn Arabi. Actually, we both studied with a wonderful man, Manhal Jamal, in Damascus. And so a number of scholars talk about Ibn Arabi's notion of the Barzakh that is not ours. So it's Barzakh before and beyond Hegel, but I guess it's Barzakh after Ibn Arabi. So there's such a notion that in Ibn Arabi that Barzakh is everything. So if Barzakh is everything, it's nothing. So we move very definitely away from that. And we are going to present our analysis of Barzakh thinking, because I talk about Barzakh epistemology. As you will hear, Bruce talks about Barzakh logic. So what became very interesting as we started to introduce Barzakh thinking into our teaching, and particularly into our work with graduate students, was how surprising it was that more and more people in Western philosophical circles were beginning to use Barzakh. So I would say that around the beginning of the 21st century, Barzakh has entered into Western theoretical thinking differently from us, but I thought it was interesting how this has become a zeitgeist. And because of the way that we're working with our students, and we have a couple of them here, and we are excited to work with them on the notion of Barzakh thinking, so the zeitgeist may continue. So let's now begin, and I hope I can do this. Yeah. Okay, just a minute.
Yeah, this is it.
We're good. Thanks.
So, first of all, I think our marriage will survive because we both inhabit the Barzakh. So that we know
Between each other.
We know what extremes are, and we know the difference between sweet and salty waters. And I'm mostly salty, and my wife is mostly sweet. So we get along as both a barrier and a bridge. So that's a confidential or familial reference. But then going back to the Holy Quran, there are these three references, and everybody makes different commentaries on them. And what we have tried to do that I think you will not have seen very much is we try to also relate it to art and architecture. So we're very curious when talking about ILEM as trying to bridge different aspects of social sciences with the humanities and with Islamic history and history of Islamic or Islamic age civilization. I think our real notion is that Barzakh also bridges the visual and the sentient and the intellectual. So Barzakh is really some way of a visual and physical as well as a metaphysical. And this is where we probably disagree most dramatically with Ibn Arabi. Instead of saying, oh, this is physical and now we're going to be metaphysical, we believe, or we argue, that the metaphysical and the physical are always interactive. That you don't leave the body and become the soul, and the soul doesn't inhabit the body and go away and be a soul. That the soul body, or what Talal said is called the mind body, the way in which the mind body interact with each other is not something that leaves one apart from the other, but combines them. And I think this is really what is the heart of the Quran. And some people, very bright students of mine, say, how can something be both a barrier and a bridge? And I said, because it separates but also joins. And this is the interesting notion of Barzakh in the Quran, the three references that I put up there. The idea from three different chapters, the confluence of Marj al-Bahrain is one is potable, the other is sweet, one is potable and sweet, the other is salty and bitter. But between them, God placed a Barzakh. So the Barzakh obviously separates, but also it links because it is only a very thin barrier. And this is even clear in Surah Al-Rahman, which for us is maybe the classic reference of all the three in the Holy Quran to the Barzakh. God mixed the two seas so they meet. Bainahuma Barzakh la yabghiyan. But between them is a Barzakh that they could not, should not, and would not overpass. And we'll talk more about that. But the one that comes back and we think is really most interesting is the whole reference to death. And we've been talking a lot about death lately because we've been visiting a friend from Istanbul who's very concerned with death, with her own death. And we're thinking about Barzakh as death, which actually is not something that happens only at the end of life, but happens every day. So here in the Quran it says when death comes to somebody, this is the end of life. He says, my Lord, send me back so I may do good in that which I've left behind. And the answer is no, it's a useless word that he speaks. Behind them, that is everyone who says, send me back, is a Barzakh until the day of resurrection. So this seems to shut the door to any relationship between the life after death and life before death. But then we have these other passages, which are really two ayahs that come from elsewhere in the Holy Quran. And I think they really need to be linked to Barzakh to understand its metaphysical and physical. And I read many commentaries, and we don't want to get into a deep conversation on tafsir unless you want to push us in that direction. We can be pushed, but we also want to be explicit and say that it has other instances besides tafsir and the realm of the mutafassirun. That there's this reference from Surah An'am, verse 60. It is he who calls back your souls by night. So every night God calls back the souls, knowing all you've done by day. Then he raises you up. This is a translation I've done with Rafi Habib, a colleague of mine with whom I'm working on a new translation of the Holy Quran. Then he raises you up to fulfill the appointed term, Ajal Musamma. To him you shall return, then he will inform you of all you've done. And even more explicit seems to me is this from Surah 39, 42. God takes the souls of people at the hour of their death, but also of those asleep who are not dead. People read this and say, how can God take you when you're asleep? Well, because you've left your active mind, and in your inactive or your soporific self, he takes the souls of those for whom he's decreed death, but the others, after having taken it for night, he sends back again until Ajal Musamma. And all this are signs for those who think. So we're trying to think. I think in what follows, I hope we have gathered some thoughts that you find interesting.
So we thought that before we went further, we might spend a little time with art. And so this is a rather extraordinary piece made of aluminum and copper wire by the Ghanaian Alana Tsui, and between heaven and earth. This is hanging in the Metropolitan Museum. And so I think one thing that, a Christian looking at this would say, well, it's purgatory. And of course, Barzakh is not purgatory, so it's not the waiting space. And we'll come back to the more specific notion of what happens when sweet water and salt water come together but are totally separate. I need to just mention something, and I'll talk about this later. That phenomenon is real. Because very many places you have a river that will come into the sea, and then you have brackish water, right? But there is never, except in certain places, the place where the purity of the sweet water and the purity of the salt water remain pure and are never mixed. And that's from Ibn Arabi also, but in the Quran as well. It is there that the pearls of the Bahraini Empire of the 6th millennium before the Common Era,
From Dilmun.
Dilmun Empire, was so rich and so widespread across the Indian Ocean, across, of course, the Arabian Sea, because of the pearls that were made in that water, that specific water. So
and also the pearl divers. You're going to come to that later?
Oh, yes. So the way you can see it today and in the 20th century, how the sweet water remains, as you know, sweet water is heavy and salt water is light. The way you can see this, if you go to the Gulf, and particularly around Bahrain, because it is the sweet waters that come from the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, through the fossil aquifers and comes around Bahrain, camels will walk into this salty water, put their heads under the water and drink. And people think, my goodness, they're drinking salt water. No, they're drinking the sweet water. The other example is the pearl divers who would go out for weeks on end, and they would bring no water with them. But because they're so used to diving for the pearls, they dive for the sweet water underneath, and they come up with a goat skin of the sweet water. You won't find this anywhere else. So the other example of an artistic rendering is Ahmed Mustafa's, and there is بينهما Barzakh لا يبغيان. And so that was...
And the thing we like so much, particularly if I could just comment on this particular evocation of the Barzakh, is that it's absolutely separate, but what comes together is the la in the middle that fills both of them. So the not, it's the irony, but the beauty of it, which of course is what irony is all about, is trying to project something that can't happen but does happen. You have the la that seems to be, in one sense, part of it is linked to the green and part of it's linked to the red, but neither one claims the total of the la. They're both and neither nor. So,
why Barzakh? Why not use another word? Why not translate it? So why, if you believe that God revealed the Quran through Gabriel, why did God use a Persian word in Inna anzalnakum Qur'anan Arabiyan? So it's an Arabic Quran. Why this word? Perhaps the only instance of a Persian word, there may be others, but this one in particular. And so if it's not translated in the Arabic Quran, maybe we can't translate it into English. Maybe we can't translate it into French, and that's why I think it becomes then a very specific way of thinking about the ways in which, and we'll talk about this, elements come together and are separated, where they hold on to their specificity and are connected. I use the term from post-colonial theorizing, métissage, some of you may know, the braiding, where when you braid something, the parts of the braid remain together, remain separate, even as they form this whole. So yes, you were talking about Hegel, and specifically what bothers us, the monistic approach, and where somehow, you know, if you have a contradiction, let's resolve it. Let's get the synthesis.
So we're not saying that Hegel is wrong, and we understand that his dialectical method has been popular because it does seem to think through even a problem that Aristotle had not described as well. When you have two opposites and two conflicting ideas that are from opposing sides, if you can bring them together, then what you have is a synthesis. But at the point that you describe a synthesis, the two parts of it have been brought together, and the synthesis provides a third way beyond it. And I think what Barzakh does is to say the two differences can't always be resolved, and there's something about the tension of keeping them together rather than the effort to bring them into one, a third one, that is. Ibn Arabi talks about Shaykh al-Thalith, the third way, but he doesn't say the third thing. I mean, he says the third thing, not the third way. So the third thing is something that's neither one nor the other, but is a third opposite, but also combined of the two. So we're trying to describe this in English, and we think it provides an agonistic. I know some of you know the philosophy from post-colonial theory about the difference between antagonism and agonism. Antagonism means you fight to the death and somebody wins and somebody loses. And there's somebody who survives and somebody who dies. But agonistic means astabiqu bil khair, as it says in the Quran. You confront each other for the good. So there's always something that's beyond, but you confront not in order to eliminate the opposite, but to gain. So it's a dynamic interaction of opposites without the collapse or elimination of one into the other.
And I think also it's really important to think about the benefit of this way of thinking, because if you have a contradiction that can't be resolved, it's really upsetting. Because how can I continue to think with a contradiction? And I think that's what Barzakh thinking does. It provides a way to continue to have to question what's happening in this meeting of opposites.
So we describe this using some terms that are familiar to almost all of you, I think, from the Quran and from Islamic thought in general, between Zahir and Batin. Again, without using all the sources that we've looked at, but there really is a difference between a variety of sources that say that what's outer is something you see and what's inner is something that's not seen. So they're not seen so much as complementary as opposites. What's visible is something which is part of the Burhan, and what is Batin is part of the Irfan. And we're going to talk about Burhan, Irfan, and Bayan in a moment. But just the idea that these are two opposites that cannot really be resolved, so they're exclusive and oppositional. But they can also be inclusive and complementary. And we think the instances from the Quran about sleep and death are especially conducive to outer and inner. Because you think of sleep as outer, of course it's just the body going to rest. But the Quran, it says God actually takes the soul back at sleep, when you're going to sleep. So it's a kind of early death. And then if your Ajal Musammas come, you don't wake up. So that is not just a nice sleep, it's an eternal sleep. But then there is the waking up again. So it's what I would call the rebirth every morning after death. So it's not death and life, it's suspension of death. It can be the completion of life and the end of life, but more likely, and thankfully in most instances that we can think of, all of us have experienced it, or we wouldn't be here today, that we have sleeping at night when we experience an early death, and then rebirth in the morning after death. So this comes, Ibn Jabr, whom some of you know, I'm very much indebted to the Moroccan, we mentioned Tayyib al-Sharif, but most of you know Ibn Jabr has worked out a whole set of theories about why reason has to be rethought, why the limits of what he calls Arab or Arabic reasoning have limited, because these three terms, Burhan, Bayan, and Irfan, are always taken as exclusive categories. You can't have one and have both. And the Burhan, in his way of reasoning, is what has been most neglected in Arabic thought in the contemporary age because it ignores empirical observation. But the beauty of Barzakh, in the way we're trying to understand it, is it recognizes the descriptive but doesn't leave it as prescriptive. Sees the prescriptive as also possibly not only descriptive but prescriptive. And that is where Bayan also merges with Adab. And we could talk more about that, but it's very interesting that he says Bayan is what's written, but it's also what's performed. And I think that's where the ambiguity of Adab is even better than Bayan, is it can be literature, of course, and adibs are people who are great literateurs, but Adab has an ethical undercurrent or reflex that is deeply instantiated in performance and not simply in reading. So it's ethical and not merely literary in nature. And I think what includes it, and this is where we relate to Irfan, is Irfan can be both Burhan, and this is not what Ibn Jabir says, but we're saying. Irfan can be part of Burhan. You can observe what happens when people are motivated by Bayan and Adab, and yet it can be part of the inner that is expressed as the outer, or the one mirroring the other. So we take these three terms, Burhan, Bayan, and Irfan, with the sideband to Bayan is also Adab.
Can I do it? Yeah, sorry, seems to have.
Well, I think we have a shorter talk.
There we go, great. Okay, so in my few introductory words, I said that although Bruce and I became fascinated by the possibilities of Barzakh thinking at the same time, we came up with very different ways of understanding Barzakh thinking. And so, you know, how do we know and understand opposites as dynamic, interactive, and expansive, not antagonistic and reductive? So that would be what my interest is, so epistemological, whereas what Bruce has come up with is more Barzakh logic. We'll talk about that. How do we deal with the irreducible elements or aspects of reality? So for me, if I can get rid of that guy, what is, aha, I think I'm okay. I'm not. It keeps on wanting to jump up.
You can
Maybe use this.
if you want.
No, nothing happening.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I don't like to do this usually, but let me just do it in the interest of time. I'm just going to quickly read off the board. So obviously, epistemology. How do we know what we know? So we know the world through differentiation. The separate atoms. We know a color because it's not all the other colors. I know green because it's not red, brown, blue, whatever. I know an atom because it's not all the other atoms. So the way in which we understand this kind of monistic, I guess. And then how do we make sense of the whole as made up of infinite units and atoms? So how do we understand relationships among units and atoms? So on the one hand, we have the compatible units and atoms, and then we have the contradictory ones. So how are atoms held together? So for the philosophers among you, you know this better than I do, but of course for the ancient Greeks, for the atomists, natural law governed cohesion. For the mutakallimun, it's God that is the one who holds together the atoms. So it's a divine process as opposed to a natural one. But what has bothered me, and I wrote something about this recently, is that in both cases of the atomists, different but somehow the same, well, the concern is not with how, but who or what. And what interests me is how. And so it seems to me that Barzakh epistemology explains the dynamic of constant separation and connection. So in some ways, for those of you who know anything about entropy, it's a little like that moment in entropy where there is so much dynamic, so much movement that nothing moves. So that would be, I guess, a physical way of thinking about this dynamic of constant separation connection. Again, I use the term abrading, where both elements are present and conjoined, yet also distinct and potentially separate. So this kind of thinking, this Barzakh epistemology, undergirds the connection and separation of everything from the smallest atom to the largest planet. Nothing could survive in differentiation without that creative tension. So let me quickly remind you of what I said earlier. We are not with Ibn Arabi on everything being a Barzakh, even though that looks like it a bit. Yours.
So for Barzakh logic, I decided to do it in two phases, to say, in just general terms, referring, and again, this is shorthand for a whole lot of other reasoning that I've done in other writings. But just to summarize it, it's not dualistic and it's not binary, but triadic. I use this. It affirms and denies, but neither affirms and denies, which seems contradictory. But it requires people to be and this is what interests me, is that Wittgenstein, with whom I had a long discussion with Tal al-Assad about Wittgenstein rethinking religion, and we both agreed that Wittgenstein is important, but we saw him as important in slightly different ways. For me, Wittgenstein is really crucial because he's a great philosopher, but he began as a mathematician engineer. And he left science, but he didn't leave the scientific way of thinking. So I think what one has to remember is to see the limits of science, one also has to know its protocols. I'm not saying every theorist is consigned to being an engineer or mathematician, but it's interesting, some of the best have also been engineers, mathematicians, scientists before they became philosophers. And I look at Bacon, Pascal, Polanyi, Peirce, all of them had, Peirce of course was just in higher mathematics, but all of them some training in mathematics before they went into logic. So Barzakh logic doesn't destroy or deny reason. That's another notion where I disagree with Jabbar when he says that reason is only about the intellect. I think reason also has other frontiers. And Barzakh probes the frontiers which are internal and sentient. That is, if you think in terms of Quran or dyads, it also relates the internal and sentient, which is the batin, with the external and cognitive, which is the zahid. So to the Persian word, we've talked about this, so I don't need to repeat it. It's simple, in the simplest form, it's division between life and death, but it's also between the divide between salt and fresh water. I think what's really crucial is it's both. It's neither just about this life and the next life, or about salt and fresh water, but it's both at the same time in ways that when you put them together seem totally contradictory, but what they do is both of them move beyond binary dualism, and instead what I call a dyad. A dyad means two that can be both and, but also neither nor. So both neither nor and both and are dyads, but neither one excludes the other. So Barzakh, in my short definition, would be Barzakh would be interactive, uninterrupted connection linking two things, whether cosmic realms like life and death, or two states of being like life, living and sleeping, or two bodies of water, which is salt and fresh, or two key terms. It doesn't reduce or dilute either one, but this is the crucial thing. It itself cannot be reduced. It can't be triangulated. This where I take opposition with Hegel, or at least the way people have interpreted Hegel. It cannot be triangulated to produce yet another form of abstraction or reductive thinking. If Barzakh logic is applied, it requires the maintenance of two and constant vigilance against the reflex to go into binary categories rather than dyadic differences and the ontology they presume and also promote. So I have three things, and Miriam is going to talk about the first two, and we're going to really try and do all this in the next 15 minutes, which I know is a hard task, but I'll be brief and Miriam will also. So we had many other instances, but we decided to reduce it to 3, and Miriam's were so different that I thought she should do 2 and I should just do 1. So the first is tribal modern as physical, and then tawajud wise and wujud as metaphysical wise and metaphorical architecture of a hall of mirrors. And that architectural metaphor allows me to talk about the Ardalan Shams Mausoleum project in Khoy, Iran. So that's what we're going to do in the next 15 minutes.
So I published a book about 8 years ago that I called Tribal Modern. And of course, for many people, it's like, tribal modern? This is an oxymoron, doesn't make any sense. And when I started to think about this, when we were in Qatar for 6 months in 2010, but also I'd been thinking about it before, I was struck by the fact that the tribal had acquired a status in the Gulf countries that was obviously very, very different from the kind of tribal that anthropologists now hate to talk about. A friend of ours who's an anthropologist, he said, "Oh my God, don't use the term tribal." And I said, but for them, it's a mark of status. And what struck me was that it was an absolutely crucial element of the way in which they were being modern. Not that it reduced the one or the other, but together enhanced both. So when I talked with a number of particularly Qataris, it became clear that the tribal element, as the Komarov husband and wife have spoken about, that the blood, purity of blood, becomes essential at the point where there is a financial or an economic benefit to be gained from having pure blood. So here it was, of course, to distinguish themselves from the huge majority of international actors. So I'll just show you very briefly. So I talk about branding new nations in the Arab Gulf in my book. And just 3 examples of it might be helpful. So ceremonial, architectural, and sport. And here, there are 3 elements here. So the tribal is made up of the hadara and the badawa. Do I assume that everybody knows these terms from Ibn Khaldun? And I was surprised that these are terms that are used today, and you know, the Hadaris think they're superior to the Badawis and vice versa. So there's been a kind of branding and braiding of Hadari and Badawi in the construction of, in Qatar's case, of an authentic tribal identity. And it always has to go back to Muhammad, whoever you ask. Oh, my family goes back to the Hejaz. So if you look at that picture, you see that there are Badawis who they left, we were there, they left at 5 o'clock in the morning from a place in the deep south to get to Doha in time to greet the FIFA royal delegation that was coming from Europe.
And of course, this is the most important picture for all of us because FIFA 2022 is almost upon us. The Qataris are about to get the goal that they sought.
But there you see, so we have the Badawis, we have the dhows that of course go back to Dilmun, and then you have the skyscrapers, what they refer to star architecture. So star architecture, and there of course the Sheikh Hamoza and the Emir upon their return. So that in the ceremonial, there is a separation of the Badawi and the Hadari to indicate the strength of the tribal combination of the pre-modern period. So this Jean Nouvel, the National Museum, he's the one who's done the Guggenheim in in Abu Dhabi, it was very specifically tribal modern, right? So the goal was you have to make a desert rose, but in fact, if you look at it, it's like a spaceship. And it is radically modern inside. The sports, here again, tribal sports. Here the picture has little children on it, but now they've developed it to the way that this traditional sport, instead of baby or young jockeys, they now have robots. And the camel and the robot that wins a Mercedes. So moving to something very, very different is Lebanese poet Huda Amani's Kitab al-Wajd wa Tawajud. And so she died last year. Great-great-granddaughter of Abdel Ghani Nabulsi. And this book is all about, it's actually all about tawajud, because and I will read briefly from Halaj, the whole notion of wajd, I think you call it, of wajd, is that in the intensity of that experience, you cannot write, nor can that experience be written. Wujud, of course, is beyond being expressible. So it's only in the indications of wajd, tawajud, that writing can happen. So her entire Kitab al-Wajd wa Tawajud is a lyrical munajat with God in the form of dhikr. And if we had time, I could read some of it to you. It will sound like Hu Allah, Hu Allah, Hu Allah, over 145 pages, but very expansive. And so what became interesting to me is that wajd is in fact, and I've now spoken with a number of people here very involved in tasawwuf, wajd is the barzakh. It's the barzakh between the indications, between that which can be written, the only thing that can be written, and wujud, the unattainable but always the goal. And in wajd, in this, what she calls bain al-bain wal-bain, between the between and the between, or min bain wa bainuna, between, from between to betweenness. And that is one of her ways from tawajud of describing the ecstatic experience of wajd. And so I've been thinking about the barzakh of ecstasy as a site where mirrors reflect tawajud and wujud to each other in an infinite mise en abîme. I'll show you that in a minute. But I think Halaj has an interesting poem that I'll quickly read to give you a sense of also his describing wajd as that which disappears and that can only be indicated within the tawajud. How wrong that he, God, be grasped in ecstasy. Burning ecstasy is the feeble indicator of weakness. Ecstasy, wajd, grasps nothing but a vanished tawajud. And ecstasy vanishes when the vision comes. I delighted in ecstasy, though fearfully. Sometimes it hides me. Other times I'm present. So, you know, this being in and out, but both at the same time. And this is crucial. He wipes out ecstasy for those who witness him. He wipes out ecstasy and all remembered meaning. So for Huda Amani, as for Halaj, wajd cannot be seen except as that. So this is the mise en abîme, right? So this is where mirrors are constantly reflecting to each other. And what goes on between, where in the middle, that would be wajd in the middle, is going to infinitely recede and always have both and neither.
Well, it's hard to go beyond that, but I'm going to try and come back to wajd, because we certainly can't claim wujud and we can't linger too much into wajd. So this is just an amiable fountain face that some of you may or may not have seen before. His name is Nadir Adalan. He's a really quite well-known Iranian-American architect. And I really had known of him, but not known him well until he read something I wrote about Barzakh and really liked it and got in touch with me. And he said, listen, I have this big project where I'm trying to figure about the Zahid in the bottom. You can see at the bottom of what I wrote there. He says, the spiritual riddle before me is I've been asked to do this architecture in Khoy, Iran for the tomb of Shams. And by the way, I'm not an innocent historian. That is to say, I don't think everything that's reported is true. Maybe I should say a guileless rather than innocent historian. I know that there's at least some controversy about whether this is actually the place where Shams was buried. But if you come from Khoy, Iran, there's no question about it. The other question is how you honor it. So he has been brought into this project, obviously funded by the Iranian government, and now put on hold because of all the difficulties with international commerce via the United States. But he has still this project which he's designed and which hopefully he was going to complete in somebody's lifetime, perhaps not mine, but perhaps not his, but maybe in some of his children's lifetime. And the idea is, how do you design a meaningful mausoleum in the 21st century for Shams? I don't need to introduce him to you, the companion of Rumi. And so the question which he poses, the one I put in bold letters here, how can the material medium of architecture facilitate a transcendental experience? And so he claims, and I have no reason to doubt, that he's been thinking about Rumi and Shams for 40 years. He looks like a very meditative man, and he's certainly well read. He's had discussions with the Rumi and Shamsi Tabrizi Foundation, people in the city of Khoy, and what he's trying to gain, this is the end of that quotation, is an understanding of the core worldviews of Rumi and Shams in Wahdat al-Wujud, which, as Miriam said, you can't convey it, you can only evoke it, and itself is based on a manifest hidden, the Zahid Batin concept of reality found in the Holy Quran. So this is what he's looking to do. And this is what he's come up with. It's an enormous design. I could do more pictures of it, but this is the essential design. You can see the dark shadow, and you can see the globe around there, but you see this funny thing that looks like a circle and not a circle down below it that has rings going around it. And this is what he describes as a new geometry, how to generate what he calls, or what he asked or wants to call, a contemporary transcendent architectural experience through a transformative new geometry. And he describes it, this is now a direct quote from his own project, a symbolic supercircle ellipsoid. A supercircle ellipsoid, clad in patterned, handmade buff brick. At its apex, a solar tracking mirror, what you just saw, that beams a ray of sunlight down on the memorial basalt cenotaph of Shams located in the sanctuary below. So when he read mine, he said, this is the Barzakh. And here it is, going back to a Danish adventurer, philosopher named Piet Hein, who invented this thing called the supercircle, which, if you look mathematically, is completely a rectangle on the one side and a circle on the other, and becomes a supercircle, which is neither a circle, but is both a circle. So the supercircle, which is the middle part, which has exactly the elements of both, while repeating that, is what he wants to claim will be the basis for this Khoy monument. So I asked him, I said, is this Piet Hein another instance of Barzakh logic? And he said, yes, it is. Because here we have two opposites, a square and a circle. Each meets each other. They can't exceed or trespass or transform the other, but they can be in a form which reflects back on the rectangle or back on the circle, depending on what you're looking at. And he said, it's like the mirror. This is his quote. The mirror shines brightest when its light is directed inward. And this, of course, is another famous Rumi quote, if light is in your heart, that is, if it shines inward, you will find your way home. So I just can't.
just with that mirror quote, I mean, that's exactly the mise en abîme.
Mise en
Right.
abîme, right.
When the light is directed inwards.
When the light is directed in. So I thought, I've talked so much about Islam and about different kinds of philosophy, but I haven't mentioned Buddhism. And I was really, it doesn't matter, but I had another conversation with somebody else who said, this sounds like Buddhism. I said, Buddhism? I don't really think so. I said, oh yes, because if you're really deeply into Buddhist thought, you know there's shunyata. And actually I know enough Sanskrit to know that, and I've read the Mahayana Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna. But until this person told me this, I'd never thought of the fact that another connection is not just back to ancient Greece or to modern German philosophy via Hegel, but also shunyata, which is the concept of emptiness that also is described as codependent origination of the idea that two truths, there can be two truths, conventional, ultimate, neither cancels the other, but what they evoke is the idea of emptiness itself. A contradiction, irony that can't itself be described. But so instead of positive beyond, going back to the Hegelian thesis, counter-thesis, and synthesis, it's a beyond which of course encourages a kind of what I would call epistemic humility to look comparatively but empathetically at multiple cosmologies. So my final statement, and we are exactly at 5 o'clock, so we're matching our Barzakh logic with a clock. The superlist is a third form that's both square and circle, neither square nor circle, honors each without surrendering its own unique balance of their opposite forms. So in my view, it projects the gaze of Barzakh logic, or to quote Rumi, if light is in your heart, you will find your way home. Thank you.
So you did talk too much issues, and
I talk too much?
no,
That's a bit rude.
no. There was too much topic. In fact, it seems it's impossible to
Oh,
discuss
okay,
all
okay.
of them.
You said too much.
No, that there was too much to put into
Yeah.
one talk.
No. And so, I don't know, probably our guests will ask something, but first of all, as a philosophy professor, I will continue to ask some things about that very concept of Barzakh. So you are somehow comparing and contrasting your topic with Hegel, to some extent.
To some
To
extent.
some extent, yeah. So this is why let me ask some things about Hegel, and let me try to ask something to you, about that concept of Barzakh with Hegelian philosophy. Okay, so simply it seems you proposed Hegelian dialectic as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis as three things, two extreme and opposite things, then
Solution.
solution or third term which will combine the other two, or which will reduce one to the other, whatever it is, I don't know. Okay, but it seems to me that Hegelian dialectic is much more than this, in fact.
No,
And
of
this
course.
thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is the simplest way of explaining Hegel, in a sense. So, in a broader sense, it seems to me that Hegel somehow tries to show us extremes, opposites. Then he tries to find a third term, which he calls as mediation. So I am asking,
Sublation.
mediation. I am asking you, that term Barzakh, in your understanding, somehow represents that concept of mediation in Hegelian philosophy? If I ask you to compare Barzakh and mediation, concept of Barzakh and concept of mediation, what you will say? If you want to ask, answer.
Well, I mean, my first response is that the difference is what is the value of the third.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that in Barzakh, the value of the third is it's either a barrier or a bridge, but it's not and of evolution. It retains the two elements. It seems to me to use temporal language, and you can just say whether I've understood or misunderstood Hegel in this point, that the temporal thing is you always have opposites that then get reconciled at another point, not only a point in thought, but a point in time. And so once you come to that synthesis, the two things that were opposite no longer seem so important because the synthesis is what emerges beyond them. And I'm saying that what happens here is that time is not evolutionary, or it's not teleological. It's not that you go through the East and the West and you get something beautiful called modern. It's that you always have East and West, if I can use those images, in tension. And it's what comes up in the construction between the two that matters most in previous times, in previous epochs. I didn't want to go too much into history, Islamicate history, but in other works of mine, I've gone deeply into how one thinks of Karl Jaspers and the axial age, and whether the Barzakh logic only applies in the axial age or also the modern age. But I think actually I could make the argument in time, temporally, that it's both, because the axial age does not presuppose the post-axial age. So there's always the notion that instead of having a modern and pre-modern, that there is a kind of process that cuts across ancient, modern, axial, and post-axial time.
Without teleology.
Without prioritizing or privileging one or the other.
There's a question. Thank you for your beautiful speech. I would like to ask a question. I don't know, maybe you may find it irrelevant to your topic, but while you were talking, a question that arose in my mind, that you said your interest had grown with the Ibn Arabi, and we know that Ibn Arabi read ancient Greek to some extent, probably the Arabic translation of ancient Greek text. I would like to ask that in the ancient Greek, especially in Plato uses a term called chora, which is defined as a formless interval, or as something between the being and non-being, or in the between the forms are received and the copied. So you can say briefly something in between. So I cannot give the whole account of the Platonic term chora, and many other philosophers such as Derrida had written on that. So shortly, do you think that Ibn Arabi's concept of Barzakh is somehow related to ancient Greeks, Plato's term chora, or do you personally think that there's any link between these two concepts?
Oh, I'm sure that there would be a link. But I guess I would go back to your definition of chora as an interval. And I think an interval is a problem because that, and in some ways, you obviously know much more about Hegel than I do, but I think the problem is this notion that there's somehow something suspended, an interval between two things, and they could be opposites, but they can also be just two different elements. The interval doesn't do. Okay.
You have it.
Oh, I see.
Your mic.
Screaming. So the interval doesn't do the work that Barzakh does. And in other words, it is an extreme dynamic that, and maybe this is something that we should have said, that eliminates the interval while saturating it with what's on either side of the interval. So that's why I thought that, the mise en abîme, that I tried to show it physically with the mirrors, is, I think, a really good way to think about it, because there is this turmoil as the two come together. and then disappear into infinity, because it's going to continually do it. And I think, just to add to what Bruce said in answer to your question, there is no teleology in this notion. We're not going anywhere. We're staying with what I think of as the entropic, the moment of entropy, and then allowing that to force thought in a different way. Yeah? It wasn't irrelevant, it was very relevant. Oh dear.
Sorry, I missed your first 15 minutes of talk, and for which Bruce is responsible because he sent me the address, which is not of this place, but of Aziz Mahmood or something. So
Oh
we spent
dear.
20 minutes finding
Oh,
this
I'm
place
sorry.
here, but that is all that. So we need to say that if my question relates to that 15 minutes which I missed, then I stand corrected. So I wanted to make 3 points. The first one is more like a comment. Now, the centrality that you bestow on this concept of Barzakh, that reminds me of reading Urdu magazine, in which there used to be something called, it used to be a humorist or humor-oriented poetry, and the title used to be Mushaira in ILEM Barzakh.
Oh,
Oh.
really?
Yeah. Now, of course, when I read at that point of time, this idea, the way you have theorized or foregrounded, that did not exist. So it would be useful to ask someone and trace that, what was the usage of that and how it relates or doesn't relate to what you are doing, or offering clarification. So that is first by way of comment. The second one, I wanted to ask you, and if I have already missed.
No, don't apologize. Go ahead, just say it. I'm sure we didn't touch on what you're going to say.
So, what exactly, like, by advancing this concept, and as I gather, it is not something related to one particular discipline, or
No.
intervention is much broader, right?
Yeah.
So, what is it that we gain? Which is another way of saying that, as Geller would say, that the value of the concept or the value of a concept is, there are many ways to gauge it, but one of them is that what is the rival concept that you are contesting? So for example, rather than talking about A, B, C, we should talk about this. So that way it clarifies, like, okay, what do we conceptually and analytically gain by focusing on this concept of Barzakh.
Can I respond?
But I also had a third point, but I can come later.
Come back to it. And I'm going to put my student on the stand just briefly, because we were talking about this just 2 days ago. So Sneha, can you talk about the way in which you were using the Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope?
Yeah, so hello everyone. My name is Sania Taha. I'm a PhD student in Ibn Khaldun University, and I'm so lucky to have Professor Miriam as my supervisor. So I'm writing my dissertation on refugee literature. We are trying to find the literary works written by Syrian refugees, specifically about the refugee experience. And recently we have been experimenting with the notions of time and space in these literary works. And this is where Barzakh comes up, because as far as I could see in these works, the refugees are very much stuck in Barzakh. As Professor Miriam said, it's a notion where there is nowhere to go to. You are just in a place where, so you left your home country, your native land, you are in a host country, wherever that might be, Turkey or Europe. But in that host country, you are unable to realize the presence. You are unable to realize the surroundings. You continuously have memories of Syria, and so the past intervenes in the present, and Syria intervenes or interferes with Turkey or Europe. And so, yeah, this is where we find out that Barzakh can actually be found in different disciplines, and it's really interesting to see how much it fits the migrant stance, and how immigrants, let's say, or refugees are actually there but not there. They would like to think of the next step, but they are still in a previous step. So the no time, no place equation is what we came up with so far. And so, and even here in this talk, I'm really struck at how the Barzakh it enriches our thinking of life, and how complicated it is, and how we are unable sometimes to find the solution. As in Hegel, we are unable sometimes to go forward. We are just there, not waiting, but at a point where we try to combine and make sense of what is happening around us, trying to make sense of both yet none situations. So yeah, thank you.
So Irfan, did that answer your question?
Yes, in a way, and that is where so the way you have explained, it seems to me, so Victor Turner would use this term called
Liminal, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Homi Bhabha would use this in the situation of migrants, the hybridity. So these terms have been in place, right? Now, to use a new liberal word, if Barzakh is a product, conceptual product, so why we should, in what way this concept is different from the existing ones, and how does it help us understand the situation in a better way? So explicating those things, as of now, just these two concepts come to my mind.
Let me just
There may be
quickly
other
jump
ones
in.
as well.
It's not a product, it's a process. It's not a product.
No, in the sense that, in neoliberal language, you say that, a concept is also a product. In that
Yeah, but anyway, who's using neoliberal language nowadays? Anyway, no, it is a dynamic process. Liminality and hybridity are, I would say, kind of the enemy of the Barzakh, because the liminality it's always on the edge, right? It's sort of this existence on the edge. Maybe the edge could be an edge between something and something else. But it seems to me, and Bruce can talk more about that it is almost like a state of exception. This notion of, state of exception.
So, also Ramazan was coming. We were going to compare to Ramazan, another part of the neoliberal vocabulary. Does it have that kind of quality of Ramazan? But then that Ramazan goes back to the whole continental philosophy of trying to think of something that twirls around. It's always a physical object, whereas this is something that's metaphysical as well as physical. But I think going back to your first comment about this is the Mushahada, I think that I was really nervous about coming here because when I heard that Muhammad Iqbal was going to be there, I didn't realize he had a last name. I thought it was the philosopher coming back. I thought, how am I ever going to say anything intelligent with Muhammad Iqbal at the table? So fortunately, you have another name, or I would be totally silenced. I would say I can't see anything in front of the reconstruction of religious thought. So, but going back to the Mushayara and going back to this, so Nabi Dharam say Manzabur. I was thinking of that Amir Khusro thing, and the Lama Khan Khusro. So the Lama Khan Khusro, which would be in the Mushayara, is the place of no place, which is where ultimate poetry is. There's no place and no time. And this is what I think Barzakh does, that other terms don't. It has both physical and metaphysical echoes of humility and irony at the same time. And I think what Miriam introduced, the fact that it's a Persian Arabic word, a Persian word that's in the Arabic, so it has divine legitimacy, even though it's got this squirrely Persian, so it allows you to go back in time and say, what are the other ways in which Barzakh reflects, even before the Holy Quran, a notion of not liminal or hybrid, but multiple serial identities at the same time. So that's what we hope to do, and still stay married.
So one final point I wanted to say, so even though one way to read it is that you might be saying that much of the way you theorize is Hegelian, but it seems to me it is also anti-Hegelian in the sense, in many ways, but one obvious sense is clearly that for Hegel, Islam has already exited.
Already receded, yeah, it's gone.
Exited the world history.
Yeah.
And the ways in which you are talking about it is to reground it or to bring it back.
That's why we said before and beyond Hegel. We like the irony of being before, because Barzakh was there before Hegel was, except for Muhammad Iqbal, of course, was there before Hegel. So we have this whole idea of different ways of thinking about reality, but not focusing only on physical or metaphysical reality, but how each is interacted with and dependent on the other. So we may not have succeeded yet, but we've just started. Late in life, but not too late to do it.
Thank
And I'm sorry for the bad address.
you.
Hello, my name is Şidem Buğdaycı, and thank you very much for your very instructive and thought-provoking talks. Well, I used the term Barzakh in my PhD dissertation recently, without knowing much about it actually. I came across a book called Barzakh from Salman Bashir.
Yeah, Salman Bashir, I mentioned him.
I thought it's a great metaphor because I wrote on love, aşk, in the 20th century Turkish history, taking it as a concept between the sacred and the secular. So as something in between the secular world construction in the 20th century and opposed to that the religious one. So yeah.
No, I mean, if I can...
No, she's halfway through.
Well, I'm very much interested.
I think it's for recording.
Okay. I'm very much interested in the term as a metaphor, and I don't know much about the Hegelian way of thinking either, but because it is in between, and because it explains a lot about the course of secularity in the 20th century, I wrote about it, but just taking it as a metaphor, as I said, and wished I had known more about your term, the tribal modern, because it seems to me that it is a way of an alternative modernity, or an alternative, it brings an alternative modern concept to interpreting secularity and modernity, because it comes from the culture itself, and it gives a new way of interpretation to approaching how secularity is constructed and how society is actually framed according to that. So as I said, I'm very interested with its relationship with modernity. And you said that tribal modern is not an alternative, it doesn't refer to alternative modernity. So, but you showed that picture of camels and skyscrapers. So it is in a modern world, I mean, it is in the world of modernity, let's say. It's just some customs, perhaps strolling around with camels, but still making use of the space in a modern way or time in a modern way. So, what makes you say that it's not alternative modernity? And what makes you say that it is not something in between the tradition and the modern, but it's rather a process?
Okay. I guess I have a problem with the term alternative modernities, because then modernity is American, it's Western, Chinese, I don't know. I mean, I think the minute that we say alternative, we're setting up, it's sort of like, Clash of Civilizations by Huntington. So we have the West and the rest. And the West is modernized, and Islam and Confucian China are the opposite. So, and there has been quite a lot of work done on deconstructing the notion of alternative modernities, because, in fact, we're all living in modernity. I mean, this is the time in which we live, and we all live differently. And within Istanbul, my goodness, how many different forms of modernity there are. You know, we're now over in Fenerbahce, and that's a way of being modern with Porsches and whatever. And then, we go to Fatih, and that's modern too. And think about fashions, right? So for some Turkish women, it's very fashionable to cover, and they buy very expensive clothes and are extremely fashionable and very modern. And then in back to Fenerbahce or whatever, Kalamış, you don't see a covered woman anywhere. There, that's modern. So I have a problem with the notion of alternative modernity. What I was trying to do with tribal modern was to take the most clashing notions, modern, whatever that is, and then tribal, which has been always by anthropologists defined as primitive. So the tribal is not traditional, and it's not primitive. It is a way in which people are defining themselves in terms of class, ethnicity, vis-a-vis the majority of imported workers. Because I felt it was there that the Barzakh epistemology was going to be the most radical way of looking at it. Because for most people, they can have Islamic modernity, and you can have, village modernity. We can local cosmopolitanism, but tribal and modern. And that's why I felt that, obviously in my book, there are hundreds of pages on the things that I showed you just in 2 slides, that shows that it's not an alternative modernity at all.
So,
May I ask a question according to this?
Yeah.
Why not call it postmodern? Because when
Oh,
you were
wow.
talking about, this is what came to my mind immediately. And it seems very like postmodern concepts, and we have it. We always discuss about this kind of things. And why call it Barzakh when we have postmodern, for example?
Oh, but
that's even worse.
Yeah, I think there's a real problem with the term postmodern, particularly if we're thinking about it theoretically. Mm-hmm. So the whole notion that somehow we can get rid of meta-narratives and somehow break down these, master narratives, like Frederick Jameson did in his. If one were to accept, in the same way that, if you were to accept that there is a modernity and an alternative, then we have a modernity that is past and something else that is totally undefined. I mean, what does that mean? It means, to me, it means nothing. Because we're always living in the modern. We're always living in the moment in different ways. So postmodernity as a theory, if that's what you're talking about, then that obviously was an attempt to deconstruct the binary way in which we see the world. I don't think it works. I mean, how many people who were, totally wedded to postmodernity postmodernism as a way of thinking, now saying, well, it doesn't really work. It's sort of like the end of history. So it's the end of modernity, and it's like, and also like post-colonialism. There's no post-colonialism.
So
colonialism continues.
So to give my response to both your question and the other question about raising the issue of secularity, which is another, both the term secularity, which we haven't addressed yet, and the term postmodern presuppose a teleological view of history.
Right.
That there's something which is sacred before it's secular, and the secular and the sacred in opposition, the secular will dominate. And postmodern, there's something modern, which we now know, and we're postmodern. But it's a teleological train of thought. And my friend Irfan has left, but when he comes back, I'll tell him that we answered this question after he left the room. Not because he left the room, but we happened to answer it. As soon as you accept the teleological notion that there, El-Ghazali, I take El-Ghazali as my stamp of why there's no postmodern. In the 11th century, which is a few centuries ago now, Al-Ghazali said, I am a modern man. I agree with him. In the 11th century, he was the most modern person around. That doesn't mean that there weren't changes, and it doesn't mean that now we look back and we say, oh, he was a pre-modern person. But actually, he was very modern in thinking about issues that are still on today. So as soon as you label something pre-modern, modern, postmodern, you've already locked yourself into a way of privileging the modern, even when you say postmodern. In the same way that when you say pre-modern, the centerpiece is modern. And getting back to my friend Irfan, I wanted to say this before he came back, is that the term, I think that I didn't answer his term, what is succession? It's succeeding this notion that there has to be an empirical scientific, there's an empirical scientific worldview. If we just discover enough about matter, if we just have enough new forms of the iPhone, that's 20 years ago, I would not have imagined I'd be traveling through Istanbul and everybody is wired to an iPhone. Pretty soon dogs will have iPhones so they can bark for food. But I mean, everything is becoming more and more technological, but it's not becoming better, it's just becoming more wired and more instant and more available. And I think the word secular, what the word secular does, I will quote somebody whom I don't like to quote, but I will quote Bernard Lewis.
If
And everybody else is now saying, oh my God, not him. Bernard Lewis said, the reason that Islam can never be secular is because it always carries the dunya with the deen. Amen. I say he's right about that, but it's not because secular is a wrong category. Secular always applies something that's better than the spiritual. Just as for Bernard Lewis, the dunya is always better than the deen. For the secularist, it's always not along with religion, but without religion. And so that implication, I had a good friend who said to me, he teaches at Yale University, Frank Griffel, I don't mind mentioning him by name. Frank Griffel said to me, you know, I don't know why you use this word Islamicate, because Islamic is so much better. I said, because I don't want to get trapped into the secular, sacred dialogue and dichotomy between saying Islam is this or Islam is not that. When he attacks, as he does, the notion of Islamicate, he's saying, oh, Islamicate is too many syllables. I'll say, well, guess what? Cosmopolitan is too many syllables too, but you still should use it. It's not the amount of syllables, it's what the work does. And Hodgson, who invented the term, did not mean to say Islamicate subsumes or replaces Islam. It expands it in other domains. It doesn't eliminate the religious, it expands it into a brighter cultural domain that includes food habits, that includes architecture, that includes art, includes sociability, includes medicine. It has many, many more diverse applications than simply deen as opposition to dunya. So I think the problem with postmodern, to me, is the same as the problem with secular. It's not what they say, it's what they don't say. And what neither says is that there is a view of a progressive, but also I would call it a dystopic view, because what it means is either the world is going to end because the West doesn't prevail, or the West prevails and the rest of the world is ended anyway. So either way, it's the end of history. This is why his book was so famous when he said the end of history and the last man, Fukuyama, is he was saying, we've now taken care of all our problems. When communism disappeared in 1990, it was only 30 years ago. It didn't disappear, but the Soviet Union disappeared. And all these people came out of the woods saying, oh, the West has triumphed, capitalism has triumphed. We're now in a post-communist world. Well, we're not in a post-communist world. We just have different nationalities. And civilization, which I haven't been asked about, but that's the category that I think is the most crucial. Civilization is not something that's West versus the rest, as Huntington said, and Lewis, who's an acolyte of Huntington on this point. There's not the best is the best is the West, and the West is, and the rest is the East is the least. That's the way some people do. The best is the West is the best, and the East is the least, and never will they meet again. That's bowdlerized Kipling, but I think that's false dichotomies, and what I hope will be the benefit of Barzakh, even if it disappears in a few years, it will get people thinking about the fact that there can be braided realities. There can't be just East versus West, or Islam and the rest. Somebody wanted me to teach a course, which I may yet teach, on Asian civilizations confronting Islam. I said, I'm really happy to teach that course, but what do you mean by Asia? Well, of course we mean China, we mean Japan. No, what I mean by Asia is what Hodgson means by Asia. West Asia, which includes Iran, which includes Turkey, which includes ancient Greece. Greece is European. No, there was no Europe in the time of Plato and Aristotle. So if you take Asia in its broader arc under a Barzakh logic view of Asia, West Asia includes almost everything, including that little thing called Europe. Europe is actually not a separate continent until recent times. Europe is the most extreme part of West Asia. So this is a wholly different way of thinking about history and a civilization theory, which I think makes it a broader and I think more sensible and more durable possibility. When Kenan is here, I see a former student and now I'm really worried.
I enjoyed
And also, Professor King is here. But you just late.
I'm a former student.
Also another former student.
Yeah.
If you have any comments or questions.
Judd, you can speak later too.
Judd?
That's Judd. Didn't you recognize Judd with the video? He became a Daliwala.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, go ahead, Kenan.
Oh my God, what are you doing here?
I'm assistant professor at the Law University and former student. Yeah, professors. So one question I have is, I really enjoyed the various things that you showed and you discussed with this notion of Barzakh, and I can see why you cherish it as a kind of important concept, a theoretical concept to use, to analyze. But something that comes to my mind is the sense of transitoriness that we see in its usage with regard to Islamic thought. At least we can say maybe not with the Sufi Islamic thought, but with the Kalam version of Islamic thought, where it is a kind of transitional space, let's say, between this world and the afterworld. So, in that sense, at least I'm a little bit worried that it might not appeal to so many people, at least in that sense, because it's not seen as a stationary place, but as a place of transition between these two places. So, and with regard to that usage also with regard to the two seas, also I think there is also that sense also. It is the kind of a veil between them, but it is not like, it doesn't seem like having a very meaningful, let's say, existence of itself, let's say. But yes, it has some kind of work, and it is important. I understand why you see it as separate from those two other things, but it doesn't seem to have that kind of, let's say, very appealing force that I think you see it in it, and I understand how you use it, and yeah, thank you.
So I'll quickly respond. I would have a problem with transitory and transitional, as I do with postmodern and alternative modernities. And maybe we didn't make it clear enough that it's not transitional at all. I mean, remember the mise en abîme, the mirrors. That, to me, is the most powerful way of thinking about it, is that it is, as a dynamic, like entropy, it's not going anywhere. So there's no teleology, there's no resolution, there's no movement elsewhere. It's a compelling of attention to be paid to opposites. They don't have to be opposites. Thinking about atoms, so thinking about atomism, you know, the way that we talked about earlier. In my article, I talk about cyber atomism because I think that's pretty much where we are now with logarithms. But it is not a veil. And I guess we just didn't make it clear enough. I mean, it is like with the water, what I was explaining. There is no mixing. There's no mixing at all. I mean, this is very strange, right? Because when salt water and sweet water mix, they produce brackish water. Undrinkable, salty, but in the Barzakh of Marj al-Bahrain, they don't mix. And that's what I think is powerful about this as a theoretical model, that we always want to resolve contradictions. In fact, it's rather lazy to want to resolve the contradiction.
I think you've raised an important point, which is when we think about this and talk about it and eventually write about it more precisely, just as the word deen, which I mentioned before, deen has multiple meanings in the Quran. You cannot, you know, I have read countless translations of the Holy Quran. There's no one translation for deen. There's several translations. The benefit of Barzakh, it doesn't come up as often as the word deen in the Holy Quran, but it comes up in very different senses. Barzakh as a barrier, as in La Yabghiyan, but the Barzakh that's a hijab, that's equivalent of the hijab or thud, is a barrier. That's between those people who have already been condemned to life after, and they want to come back, and there's a barrier, they can't go back. But that's a different kind of that is the Barzakh of after death looking back. But the between death and life is a more fluctuating one, which is between salt and fetfort. So I think Barzakh is more an intermediate term than it is a kind of absolutist final term. But both meanings are possible from the Quran. What I object to is when people, and I've had debates with people say, oh, something can't be both a barrier and a bridge. I said, but when you think about it, as in the picture of Ahmed Mustafa, the la, one part of the la is exactly a bridge as well as a barrier between the Barzakh on one side and the Barzakh on the other. So there is a connection, but it's a connection which affirms the separation at the same time as it benefits it. And I agree with you that not everybody's going to like it. All of our postmodern friends will say, no, no, we want postmodern. All our secular friends will say, it's not secular enough. But if it's right, it'll take time. Marshall Hodgson died in 1968. There are now people in 2022 who are writing books on Islamicate is a really important concept. We just didn't use it before. So maybe we have to wait 60 years.
Well, I'd like to, though, go back to what Snia was saying about the way that Syrian refugees are living their lives in Berlin and Turkey and Scandinavia. And that is, they are living Syria and Berlin
At the same time.
and neither. Because they cannot purify, distill the one from the other. And so it's this constant coming together but doesn't mix. So it's you know, maybe at some point a Syrian refugee will have learned German well enough and will have been in the country long enough, begin to think of herself as German, and then she may be out of the Barzakh. Chances she won't be, but anyway, I think it's such a concrete way of thinking about the different times and places. In other words, the different chronotypes that break into each other.
That makes sense, definitely. I appreciate and I can see that. But just I was kind of trying to allude to this ontological kind of understanding in Islamic theology, where it's used as a station between this world and the afterworld. So, but I definitely appreciate the way you want to use it with regard to our current problems and.
But the problem about the station between this life and the other is that it's that life
Yes.
and this life together.
Yes.
But neither is there, right? Because you're dead and you're alive, but you're not dead and you're not alive. So it's not a station.
So we should allow Muhammad Iqbal to have the last word.
Possible, I don't know. So from what you
I
talked,
just had one small point. Can you tell us very briefly, how did you get there?
Oh, that's the part you missed. We'll tell you later.
We
That was the
tell-
15 minutes. We talked about it at the beginning.
We'll have dinner. We'll tell
We'll
you
have
over
dinner,
dinner.
tell you over dinner in detail.
okay, until now we talked about that concept of Barzakh and what I understand until now. Somehow you also you are thinking within opposites, within extremes. But you are trying to say that there will be opposites, and it will be impossible to overcome or to transform that opposites into each other. They will always stay as opposites. What I understand is that. But there will be an intermediary between opposites, and that intermediary somehow will be and will not be at the same time, two opposites. So, can we, what I understand is that almost all of dualities, we are living in the world and we are living within dualities, somehow can be taught within that way. So, for example, duality of women and man is a duality.
Right.
And it seems there is some kind of barrier, and that barrier somehow will relate and will separate them.
As long as it's not a trans.
Yes. And so the destruction of, for example, that barrier somehow result in some kind of postmodernity, some kind of an absolute destruction, it seems to me. So, but even this is so, I see some kind of danger, which is related with the reduction of extremes to Barzakh.
Yeah, the reductionary in Barzakh can be a problem. You're right.
Yeah.
That's our issue with Ibn Arabi.
Because he reduces everything to a Barzakh, then you have nothing which distinguishes the Barzakh. If the whole world becomes a series of Barzakhs, then it's simply
Meaningless.
particles or atoms, but no distinction of what their value is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I have also a theological question. In fact, if you want, I can answer. How can you interpret that concept of Holy Spirit in Christianity?
Of what?
Holy Spirit. For example, can we think of that concept?
what concept?
Holy Spirit.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Okay.
Can it be taught as a category of mediation or as Barzakh? What do you say?
Mediation.
Mediation.
What do you say?
As somebody who's a good Christian, I'll quote Surah Maryam. The Surah Maryam is not the Holy Spirit, it's a Ruh al-Quds. It's the Spirit of the Holy, not the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
So the Holy is always something that is beyond the Spirit. The Spirit is the messenger, not the message. That's how, because in the classical Trinitarian theology, the Spirit is something independent. but in a more general sense,
Monophysite.
if there's just God and Gabriel, there's always God as the ultimate source, Gabriel is the mediator, and the Ruh is the other expression of Gabriel. So it's not a third being, it's an extension of Gabriel, of Jabril.
Yeah.
So that's my Christian understanding of the Islamic tradition.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
At least for me.
It's almost
it
2
is
hours.
What?
You get.
No.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Now we can finish. It's almost 2 hours. We'll have some small gifts for you, some books, which I will.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.